This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Monique Michener. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 37. The subject continued. In the first place, and as a matter of the greatest necessity, we are bound to describe how a house may be got for nothing a year. These mansions are to be had either unfurnished, where, if you have credit with Messrs. Gillows or Bantings, you can get them splendidly Montes and decorated entirely according to your own fancy, or they are to be let furnished, a less troublesome and complicated arrangement to most parties. It was so that Crawley and his wife preferred to hire their house. Before Mr. Bowles came to preside over Miss Crawley's house and cellar in Park Lane, that lady had had for a butler a Mr. Raggles, who was born on the family estate of Queen's Crawley, and indeed was a younger son of a gardener there. By good conduct, a handsome person in calves, and a grave demeanour, Raggles rose from the knife-board to the footboard of the carriage, from the footboard to the butler's pantry. When he had been a certain number of years at the head of Miss Crawley's establishment, where he had had good wages, fat perquisites, and plenty of opportunities of saving, he announced that he was about to contract a matrimonial alliance with a late cook of Miss Crawley's, who had subsisted in an honourable manner by the exercise of a mangle, and the keeping of a small greengrocer's shop in the neighbourhood. The truth is, that the ceremony had been clandestinely performed some years back, although the news of Mr. Raggles's marriage was first brought to Miss Crawley by a little boy and girl of 7 and 8 years of age, whose continual presence in the kitchen had attracted the attention of Miss Briggs. Mr. Raggles then retired and personally undertook the superintendence of the small shop and the greens. He added milk and cream, eggs and country-fed pork to his stores, contenting himself whilst other retired butlers were vending spirits in public houses by dealing in the simplest country produce, and having a good connection amongst the butlers in the neighbourhood, and a snug back parlour where he and Mrs. Raggles received them, his milk, cream, and eggs got to be adopted by many of the fraternity, and his profits increased every year. Year after year he quietly and modestly amassed money, and when at length that snug and complete bachelor's residence at number 201 Curzon Street, Mayfair, lately the residence of the Honourable Frederick de Seuss, gone abroad, with its rich and appropriate furniture by the first makers, was brought to the hammer. Who should go in and purchase the lease and furniture of the house but Charles Raggles? A part of the money he borrowed, it is true, and at rather a high interest from a brother butler, but the chief part he paid down, and it was with no small pride that Mrs. Raggles found herself sleeping in a bed of carved mahogany, with silk curtains, with a prodigious cheval-glass opposite to her, and a wardrobe which would contain her and Mr. Raggles and all the family. Of course they did not intend to occupy permanently an apartment so splendid. It was in order to let the house again that Raggles purchased it. As soon as a tenant was found, he subsided into the greengrocer's shop once more. But a happy thing it was for him to walk out of that tenement and into Curzon Street, and there survey his house, his own house, with geraniums in the window and a carved bronze knocker, The footmen, occasionally lounging at the area railing, treated him with respect. The cook took her green stuff at his house and called him Mr. Landlord, and there was not one thing the tenants did, or one dish which they had for dinner, that Raggles might not know of if he liked. He was a good man, good and happy. The house brought him in so handsome a yearly income that he was determined to send his children to good schools, and accordingly, regardless of expense, Charles was sent to boarding at Dr. Swishdale's sugar-cane lodge, and little Matilda to Miss Peckover's Laurentianum house, Clapham. Raggles loved and adored the Crawley family as the author of all his prosperity in life. He had a silhouette of his mistress in his back shop, and a drawing of the porter's lodge at Queen's Crawley done by that spinster herself in India ink, and the only addition he made to the decorations of the Curzon Street house was a print of Queen's Crawley in Hampshire, the seat of Sir Walpole Crawley, Baronet, who was represented in a gilded car drawn by 6 white horses, and passing by a lake covered with swans, and barges containing ladies in hoops, and musicians with flags and pinwigs. Indeed, Raggles thought there was no such palace in all the world, and no such august family. As luck would have it, Raggles's house in Curzon Street was to let when Rawdon and his wife returned to London. The Colonel knew it, and its owner quite well. The latter's connection with the Crawley family had been kept up constantly, for Raggles's helped Mr. Bowles whenever Miss Crawley received friends, and the old man not only let his house to the Colonel, but officiated as his butler whenever he had company, Mrs. Raggles operating in the kitchen below, and sending up dinners of which old Miss Crawley herself might have approved. This was the way, then, Crawley got his house for nothing, for though Raggles had to pay taxes and rates, and the interest of the mortgage to the brother butler, and the insurance of his life, and the charges for his children at school, and the value of the meat and drink which his own family, and for a time that of Colonel Crawley too, consumed, and though the poor wretch was utterly ruined by the transaction, his children being flung on the streets, and himself driven into the Fleet prison, yet somebody must pay even for gentlemen who live for nothing a year, and so it was this unlucky Raggles was made the representative of Colonel Crawley's defective capital. I wonder how many families are driven to roguery and to ruin by great practitioners in Crawley's way. How many great noblemen rob their petty tradesmen, condescend to swindle their poor retainers out of wretched little sums, and cheat for a few shillings. When we read that a noble nobleman has left for the Continent, or that another noble nobleman has an execution in his house, and that one or other owes 6 or 7 millions, the defeat seems glorious even, and we respect the victim in the vastness of his ruin. But who pities a poor barber who can't get his money for powdering the footmen's heads, or a poor carpenter who has ruined himself by fixing up ornaments and pavilions for my lady's déjeuner, or the poor devil of a tailor whom the steward patronizes, and who has pledged all he is worth and more, to get the liveries ready, which my lord has done him the honour to bespeak? When the great house tumbles down, these miserable wretches fall under it unnoticed. As they say in the old legends, before a man goes to the devil himself, he sends plenty of other souls thither. Rawdon and his wife generously gave their patronage to all such of Miss Crawley's tradesmen and purveyors as chose to serve them. Some were willing enough, especially the poor ones. It was wonderful to see the pertinacity with which the washerwoman from Tooting brought the cart every Saturday, and her bills week after week. Mr. Raggles himself had to supply the green groceries. The bill for servants as porter at the Fortune of War public house is a curiosity in the chronicles of beer. Every servant also was owed the greater part of his wages, and thus kept up perforce an interest in the house. Nobody, in fact, was paid, not the blacksmith who opened the lock, nor the glazier who mended the pane, nor the jobber who led the carriage, nor the groom who drove it, nor the butcher who provided the leg of mutton, nor the coals which roasted it, nor the cook who basted it, nor the servants who ate it. And this, I am given to understand, is not unfrequently the way in which people live, elegantly, on nothing a year. In a little town such things cannot be done without remark. We know there the quantity of milk our neighbor takes in a spy the joint or the fowls which are going in for his dinner. So probably 200 and 202 in Curzon Street might know what was going on in the house between them, the servants communicating through the area railings. But Crawley and his wife and his friends did not know 200 and 202. When you came to 201, there was a hearty welcome, a kind smile, a good dinner, and a jolly shake of the hand from the host and hostess there, just for all the world as if they had been undisputed masters of 3,000 or 4,000 a year, and so they were, not in money, but in produce and labor. If they did not pay for the mutton, they had it. If they did not give bullion in exchange for their wine, how should we know? Never was better claret at any man's table than at honest Rawdon's. Dinners more gay and neatly served. His drawing-rooms were the prettiest, little modest salons conceivable. They were decorated with the greatest taste, and 1,000 knick-knacks from Paris by Rebecca. And when she sat at her piano trilling songs with a lightsome heart, the stranger voted himself in a little paradise of domestic comfort, and agreed that, if the husband was rather stupid, the wife was charming, and the dinners the pleasantest in the world. Rebecca's wit, cleverness, and flippancy made her speedily the vogue in London among a certain class. You saw demure chariots at her door, out of which stepped very great people. You beheld her carriage in the park, surrounded by dandies of note. The little box in the third tier of the opera was crowded with heads constantly changing, but it must be confessed that the ladies held aloof from her, and that their doors were shut to our little adventurer. With regard to the world of female fashion and its customs, the present writer, of course, can only speak at second hand. A man can no more penetrate or understand those mysteries than he can know what the ladies talk about when they go upstairs after dinner. It is only by inquiry and perseverance that one sometimes gets hints of those secrets, and by a similar diligence every person who treads the Pall Mall pavement and frequents the clubs of this metropolis knows, either through his own experience or through some acquaintance with whom he plays at billiards or shares the joint, something about the genteel world of London, and how, as there are men, such as Rawdon Crawley, whose position we mentioned before, who cut a good figure to the eyes of the ignorant world and to the apprentices in the park, who behold them consorting with the most notorious dandies there. So there are ladies, who may be called men's women, being welcomed entirely by all the gentlemen, and cut or slighted by all their wives. Mrs. Firebrace is of this sort, the lady with the beautiful fair ringlets whom you see every day in Hyde Park, surrounded by the greatest and most famous dandies of this empire. Mrs. Rockwood is another, whose parties are announced laboriously in the fashionable newspapers, and with whom you see that all sorts of ambassadors and great noblemen dine. And many more might be mentioned had they to do with the history at present in hand. But while simple folks who are out of the world, or country people with a taste for the genteel, behold these ladies in their seeming glory in public places, or envy them from afar off, persons who are better instructed could inform them that these envied ladies have no more chance of establishing themselves in society than the benighted squire's wife in Somersetshire, who reads of their doings in the Morning Post. Men living about London are aware of these awful truths. You hear how pitilessly many ladies of seeming rank and wealth are excluded from this society. The frantic efforts which they make to enter this circle, the meanness to which they submit, the insults which they undergo, are matters of wonder to those who take human or womankind for a study, and the pursuit of fashion under difficulties would be a fine theme for any very great person who had the wit, the leisure, and the knowledge of the English language necessary for the compiling of such a history. Now the few female acquaintances whom Mrs. Crawley had known abroad not only declined to visit her when she came to this side of the Channel, but cut her severely when they met in public places. It was curious to see how the great ladies forgot her, and no doubt not altogether a pleasant study to Rebecca. When Lady Berequis met her in the waiting-room at the opera, she gathered her daughters about her as if they would be contaminated by a touch of Becky, and retreating a step or two, placed herself in front of them and stared at her little enemy. To stare Becky out of countenance required a severe glance that even the frigid old Berequis could shoot out of her dismal eyes. When Lady de la Mole, who had ridden a score of times by Becky's side at Brussels, met Mrs. Crawley's open carriage in Hyde Park, her ladyship was quite blind, and could not in the least recognize her former friend. Even Mrs. Blenkinsop, the banker's wife, cut her at church. Becky went regularly to church now. It was edifying to see her enter there, with Rawdon by her side, carrying a couple of large gilt prayer-books, and afterwards going through the ceremony with the gravest resignation. Rawdon at first felt very acutely the slights which were passed upon his wife, and was inclined to be gloomy and savage. He talked of calling out the husbands or brothers of every one of the insolent women who did not pay a proper respect to his wife, and it was only by the strongest commands and entreaties on her part that he was brought into keeping a decent behavior. "You can't shoot me into society," she said good-naturedly. "Remember, my dear, that I was but a governess, and you poor silly old man, have the worst reputation for debt, and dice, and all sorts of wickedness. We shall get quite as many friends as we want by and by, and in the meanwhile you must be a good boy and obey your schoolmistress in everything she tells you to do. When we heard that your aunt had left almost everything to Pitt and his wife, do you remember what a rage you were in? You would have told all Paris. If I had not made you keep your temper, where would you have been now? In prison at St. Pelagie for debt, and not established in London in a handsome house, with every comfort about you. You were in such a fury, you were ready to murder your brother, you wicked Cain, you. And what good would have come of remaining angry? All the rage in the world won't get us your aunt's money, and it is much better that we should be friends with your brother's family than enemies, as those foolish Buttes are. When your father dies, Queen's Crawley will be a pleasant house for you and me to pass the winter in. If we are ruined, you can carve and take charge of the stable, and I can be a governess to Lady Jane's children. Ruined? Fiddle-dee! I will get you a good place before that, or Pitt and his little boy will die, and we will be Sir Rawdon and my lady. While there is life, there is hope, my dear, and I intend to make a man of you yet. Who sold your horses for you? Who paid your debts for you? Rawdon was obliged to confess that he owed all these benefits to his wife, and to trust himself to her guidance for the future. Indeed, when Miss Crawley quitted the world, and that money for which all her relatives had been fighting so eagerly was finally left to Pitt, Bute Crawley, who found that only £5,000 had been left to him instead of the 20 upon which he calculated, was in such a fury at his disappointment that he vented it in savage abuse upon his nephew, and the quarrel always rankling between them ended in an utter breach of intercourse. Rawdon Crawley's conduct, on the other hand, who got but £100, was such as to astonish his brother and delight his sister-in-law, who was disposed to look kindly upon all the members of her husband's family. He wrote to his brother a very frank, manly, good-humoured letter from Paris. He was aware, he said, that by his own marriage he had forfeited his aunt's favour, and though he did not disguise his disappointment that she should have been so entirely relentless towards him, he was glad that the money was still kept in their branch of the family, and heartily congratulated his brother on his good fortune. He sent his affectionate remembrances to his sister, and hoped to have her good will for Mrs. Rawdon, and the letter concluded with a postscript to Pitt in the latter lady's own handwriting. She, too, begged to join in her husband's congratulations. She should ever remember Mr. Crawley's kindness to her in early days when she was a friendless orphan, the instructress of his little sisters, in whose welfare she still took the tenderest interest. She wished him every happiness in his married life, and asking his permission to offer her remembrances to Lady Jane, of whose goodness all the world informed her. She hoped that one day she might be allowed to present her little boy to his uncle and aunt, and begged to bespeak for him their good will and protection. Pitt Crawley received this communication very graciously, more graciously than Miss Crawley had received some of Rebecca's previous compositions in Rawdon's handwriting. And as for Lady Jane, she was so charmed with the letter that she expected her husband would instantly divide his aunt's legacy into 2 equal portions and send off 1/2 to his brother at Paris. To her ladyship's surprise, however, Pitt declined to accommodate his brother with a cheque for £30,000, but he made Rawdon a handsome offer of his hand whenever the latter should come to England and choose to take it, and, thanking Mrs. Crawley for her good opinion of himself and Lady Jane, he graciously pronounced his willingness to take any opportunity to serve her little boy. Thus an almost reconciliation was brought about between the brothers. When Rebecca came to town, Pitt and his wife were not in London. Many a time she drove by the old door in Park Lane to see whether they had taken possession of Miss Crawley's house there. But the new family did not make any appearance. It was only through Raggles that she heard of their movements, how Miss Crawley's domestics had been dismissed with decent gratuities, and how Mr. Pitt had only once made his appearance in London, when he stopped for a few days at the house, did business with his lawyers there, and sold off all Miss Crawley's French novels to a bookseller out of Bond Street. Becky had reasons of her own which caused her to long for the arrival of her new relation. When Lady Jane comes, thought she shall be my sponsor in London society. And as for the women, bah! The women will ask me when they find the men want to see me. An article as necessary to a lady in this position as her brougham or her bouquet is her companion. I have always admired the way in which the tender creatures, who cannot exist without sympathy, hire an exceedingly plain friend of their own sex from whom they are almost inseparable. The sight of that inevitable woman in her faded gown seated behind her dear friend in the opera box, or occupying the back seat of the barouche, is always a wholesome and moral one to me, as jolly a reminder as that of the death's head which figured in the repasts of Egyptian bon vivants, a strange sardonic memorial of Vanity Fair. What? Even battered, brazen, beautiful, heartless Mrs. Firebrace, whose father died of her shame, even lovely, daring Mrs. Montrup, who will ride at any fence which any man in England will take, and who drives her greys in the park, while her mother keeps a huckster's stall in Bothstill. Even those who are so bold, one might fancy they could face anything dare not face the world without a female friend. They must have somebody to cling to, the affectionate creatures, and you will hardly see them in any public place without a shabby companion in a dyed silk, sitting somewhere in the shade close behind them. "Rawdon," said Becky, very late one night, as a party of gentlemen were seated round her crackling drawing-room fire, for the men came to her house to finish the night, and she had ice and coffee for them, the best in London. "I must have a sheep-dog." "A what?" said Rawdon, looking up from a card table. "A sheep-dog," said young Lord Southdown. "My dear Mrs. Crawley, what a fancy! Why not have a Danish dog? I know of one as big as a camel leopard. By Jove, it would almost pull your brougham. Or a Persian greyhound, eh? I propose, if you please. Or a little pug that will go into one of Lord Stein's snuff-boxes. There's a man at Bayswater got one with such a nose that you might, I marked the king in play, that you might hang your hat on it." "I marked the trick," Rawdon gravely said. He attended to his game commonly and didn't much meddle with the conversation, except when it was about horses and betting. "What can you want with a shepherd's dog?" the lively little Southdown continued. "I mean a moral shepherd's dog," said Becky, laughing and looking at Lord Stein. "What the devil's that?" said his lordship. "A dog to keep the wolves off me," Rebecca continued, "a companion." "Dear little innocent lamb, you want one?" said the Marquis, and his jaw thrust out, and he began to grin hideously, his little eyes leering towards Rebecca. The great Lord of Stein was standing by the fire sipping coffee. The fire crackled and blazed pleasantly. There was a score of candles sparkling round the mantelpiece, in all sorts of quaint sconces of gilt and bronze and porcelain. They lighted up Rebecca's figure to admiration, as she sat on a sofa covered with a pattern of gaudy flowers. She was in a pink dress that looked as fresh as rose. Her dazzling white arms and shoulders were half covered with a thin, hazy scarf through which they sparkled. Her hair hung in curls round her neck. One of her little feet peeped out from the fresh, crisp folds of the silk. The prettiest little foot in the prettiest little sandal in the finest silk stocking in the world. The candles lighted up Lord Stein's shining bald head, which was fringed with red hair. He had thick bushy eyebrows, with little twinkling bloodshot eyes, surrounded by 1,000 wrinkles. His jaw was underhung, and when he laughed, 2 white buck teeth protruded themselves and glistened savagely in the midst of the grin. He had been dining with royal personages, and wore his garter and ribbon. A short man was his lordship, broad-chested and bow-legged, but proud of the fineness of his foot and ankle, and always caressing his garter knee. "And so the shepherd is not enough," said he, to defend his lambkin. "The shepherd is too fond of playing at cards and going to his clubs," answered Becky, laughing. "Gad, what a debauched Corydon," said my lord. "What a mouth for a pipe!" "I take your 3 to 2 here," said Rawdon at the card-table. "Hark at Melibus!" snarled the noble Marquis. "He's pastorally occupied too. He's shearing a Southdown. What an innocent mutton, hey? Damme, what a snowy fleece!" Rebecca's eyes shot out gleams of scornful humor. "My lord," she said, "you are a knight of the order." He had the collar round his neck, indeed, a gift of the restored princes of Spain. Lord Stein in early life had been notorious for his daring and his success at play. He had sat up 2 days and 2 nights with Mr. Fox at hazard. He had won money of the most august personages of the realm. He had won his marquisate, it was said, at the gaming table, but he did not like an allusion to those bygone days. Rebecca saw the scowl gathering over his heavy brow. She rose up from her sofa and went and took his coffee-cup out of his hand with a little curtsy. "Yes," she said, "I must get a watchdog, but he won't bark at you." And going into the other drawing-room, she sat down to the piano and began to sing little French songs in such a charming, thrilling voice that the mollified nobleman speedily followed her into that chamber, and might be seen nodding his head and bowing time over her. Rawdon and his friend meanwhile played a cart until they had enough. The colonel won, but, say that he won ever so much and often, nights like these, which occurred many times in the week, his wife having all the talk and all the admiration, and he sitting silent without the circle, not comprehending a word of the jokes, the allusions, the mystical language within, must have been rather wearisome to the ex-dragoon. "How is Mrs. Crawley's husband?" Lord Stein used to say to him by way of a good day when they met, and indeed that was now his avocation in life. He was Colonel Crawley no more. He was Mrs. Crawley's husband. about the little Rawdon. If nothing has been said all this while, it is because he is hidden upstairs in a garret somewhere, or has crawled below into the kitchen for companionship. His mother scarcely ever took notice of him. He passed the days with his French bonne as long as that domestic remained in Mr. Crawley's family, and when the Frenchwoman went away, the little fellow, howling in the loneliness of the night, had compassion taken on him by a housemaid, who took him out of his solitary nursery into her bed in the garret hard by, and comforted him. Rebecca, my Lord Stein, and one or two more were in the drawing-room, taking tea after the opera, when the shouting was heard overhead. "It's my cherub crying for his nurse," she said. She did not offer to move to go and see the child. "Don't agitate your feelings by going to look for him," said Lord Stein sardonically. "Bah!" replied the other, with a sort of blush. "He'll cry himself to sleep." And they fell to talking about the opera. Rawdon had stolen off, though, to look after his son and heir, and came back to the company when he found that honest Dolly was consoling the child. The Colonel's dressing-room was in those upper regions. He used to see the boy there in private. They had interviews together every morning when he shaved, Rawdon minor sitting on a box by his father's side and watching the operation with never-ceasing pleasure. He and the sire were great friends. The father would bring him sweetmeats from the dessert and hide them in a certain old epaulette box where the child went to seek them, and laughed with joy on discovering the treasure. Laughed, but not too loud, for mamma was below asleep, and must not be disturbed. She did not go to rest till very late, and seldom rose till afternoon. Rawdon bought the boy plenty of picture books, and crammed his nursery with toys. Its walls were covered with pictures pasted up by the father's own hand, and purchased by him for ready money. When he was off duty with Mrs. Rawdon in the park, he would sit up there, passing hours with the boy, who rode on his chest, who pulled his great moustachios as if they were driving reins, and spent days with him in indefatigable gambols. The room was a low room, and once, when the child was not 5 years old, his father, who was tossing him wildly up in his arms, hit the poor little chap's skull so violently against the ceiling that he almost dropped the child, so terrified was he at the disaster. Rawdon minor had made up his face for a tremendous howl. The severity of the blow indeed authorized that indulgence, but just as he was going to begin, the father interposed. "For God's sake, Rowdy, don't wake mamma," he cried, and the child, looking in a very hard and piteous way at his father, bit his lips, clenched his hands, and didn't cry a bit. Rawdon told that story at the clubs, at the mess, to everybody in town. "By God, sir," he explained to the public in general, "what a good plucked one that boy of mine is! What a trump he is! I half sent his head through the ceiling, by Gad, and he couldn't cry for fear of disturbing his mother." Sometimes, once or twice in a week, that lady visited the upper regions in which the child lived. She came like a vivified figure out of the Magazine des Modes, blandly smiling in the most beautiful new clothes and little gloves and boots. Wonderful scarfs, laces, and jewels glittered about her. She had always a new bonnet on, and flowers bloomed perpetually in it, or else magnificent curling ostrich feathers, soft and snowy as camellias. She nodded twice or thrice patronizingly to the little boy, who looked up from his dinner or from the pictures of soldiers he was painting. When she left the room, An odor of rose or some other magical fragrance lingered about the nursery. She was an unearthly being in his eyes, superior to his father, to all the world, to be worshipped and admired at a distance. To drive with that lady in the carriage was an awful rite. He sat up in the back seat and did not dare to speak. He gazed with all his eyes at the beautifully dressed princess opposite to him. Gentlemen on splendid prancing horses came up and smiled and talked with her. How her eyes beamed upon all of them! Her hand used to quiver and wave gracefully as they passed. When he went out with her he had his new red dress on. His old brown holland was good enough when he stayed at home. Sometimes when she was away, and Dolly his maid was making his bed, he came into his mother's room. It was as the abode of a fairy to him, a mystique chamber of splendid and delights. There in the wardrobe hung those wonderful robes, pink and blue and many-tinted. There was the jewel case, several clasps, and the wondrous bronze hand on the dressing-table, glistening all over with 100 rings. There was the cheval-glass, that miracle of art, in which he could just see his own wondering head, and the reflection of Dolly, queerly distorted, and as if up in the ceiling, plumping and patting the pillows of the bed. "Oh, thou poor lonely little benighted boy!" Mother is the name for God in the lips and hearts of little children, and here was one who was worshipping a stone. Now Rawdon Crawley, rascal as the colonel was, had certainly manly tendencies of affection in his heart, and could love a child and a woman still. For Rawdon minor he had a great secret tenderness then, which did not escape Rebecca. Though she did not talk about it to her husband, it did not annoy her. She was too good-natured. It only increased her scorn for him. He felt somehow ashamed of this paternal softness and hid it from his wife, only indulging in it when alone with the boy. He used to take him out of mornings when they would go to the stables together and to the park. Little Lord Southdown, the best-natured of men, who would make you a present of the hat from his head, and whose main occupation in life was to buy knick-knacks that he might give them away afterwards, bought the little chap a pony not much bigger than a large rat. The donor said, and on this little black Shetland pygmy young Rawdon's great father was pleased to mount the boy, and to walk by his side in the park. It pleased him to see his old quarters, and his old fellow guardsmen at Knightsbridge. He had begun to think of his bachelorhood with something like regret. The old troopers were glad to recognize their ancient officer and dandle the little colonel. Colonel Crawley found dining at mess, and with his brother officers, very pleasant. "Hang it, I ain't clever enough for her, I know it. She won't miss me," he used to say, and he was right. His wife did not miss him. Rebecca was fond of her husband. She was always perfectly good-humored and kind to him. She did not even show her scorn much for him. Perhaps she liked him the better for being a fool. He was her upper servant and maitre d'hotel. He went on her errands, obeyed her orders without question, drove in the carriage in the ring with her without repining, took her to the opera box, solaced himself at his club during the performance, and came punctually back to fetch her when done. He would have liked her to be a little fonder of the boy, but even to that he reconciled himself. "Hang it, you know she's so clever," he said, "and I'm not literary in that, you know. For as we have said before, it requires no great wisdom to be able to win at cards and billiards, and Rawdon made no pretensions to any other sort of skill." When the companion came, his domestic duties became very light. His wife encouraged him to dine abroad. She would let him off duty at the opera. "Don't stay and stupefy yourself at home tonight, my dear," she would say. "Some men are coming who will only bore you. I would not ask them, but you know it's for your good. And now I have a sheep-dog. I need not be afraid to be alone." A sheep-dog, a companion! Becky Sharp with a companion! "Isn't it good fun?" thought Mrs. Crawley to herself. The notion tickled hugely her sense of humor. One Sunday morning, as Rawdon Crawley, his little son, and the pony were taking their accustomed walk in the park, they passed by an old acquaintance of the Colonel's, Corporal Clink, of the regiment, who was in conversation with a friend, an old gentleman, who held a boy in his arms about the age of little Rawdon. This other youngster had seized hold of the Waterloo medal which the corporal wore, and was examining it with delight. "Good morning, your honor," said Clink, in reply to the "How do, Clink?" of the colonel. "This 'ere young gentleman is about the little colonel's age, sir," continued the corporal. "His father was a Waterloo man too, and the old gentleman who carried the boy, wasn't he Georgy?" "Yes," said Georgy. He and the little chap on the pony were looking at each other with all their might, solemnly scanning each other as children do. "In a line regiment," Clink said with a patronizing air. "He was a captain in the regiment," said the old gentleman rather pompously. "Captain George Osborne, sir. Perhaps you knew him. He died the death of a hero, sir, fighting against the Corsican tyrant." Colonel Crawley blushed quite red. "I knew him very well, sir," he said, "and his wife, his dear little wife. Sir, how is she?" "She is my daughter, sir," said the old gentleman, putting down the boy and taking out a card with great solemnity, which he handed to the colonel. On it written, "Mr. Sedley, sole agent for the Black Diamond and Anti-Cinder Coal Association, Bunker's Wharf, Thames Street, and Anna Maria Cottages, Fulham Road, West." Little Georgy went up and looked at the Shetland pony. "Should you like to have a ride?" said Rawdon minor from the saddle. "Yes," said Georgy. The colonel, who had been looking at him with some interest, took up the child and put him on the pony behind Rawdon minor. "Take hold of him, Georgy," he said. "Take my little boy round the waist. His name is Rawdon." And both the children began to laugh. "You won't see a prettier pair, I think, this summer's day, sir," said the good-natured corporal, and the colonel, the corporal, and old Mr. Sedley with his umbrella walked by the side of the children. End of chapter 37.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Chris the Girl. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 38. A Family in a Very Small Way. We must suppose little George Osborne was ridden from Knightsbridge towards Fulham, and will stop and make inquiries at that village regarding some friends whom we have left there. How is Mrs. Amelia after the storm of Waterloo? Is she living and thriving? What has come of Major Dobbin, whose cab was always hankering about her premises? And is there any news of the collector of Bogley-Wollah? The facts concerning the latter are briefly these. Our worthy fat friend Joseph Sedley returned to India not long after his escape from Brussels. Either his furlough was up, or he dreaded to meet any witnesses of his Waterloo flight. However it might be, he went back to his duties in Bengal very soon after Napoleon had taken up his residence at St. Helena, where Joss saw the ex-emperor. To hear Mr. Sedley talk on board ship, you would have supposed that it was not the first time he and the Corsican had met, and that the civilian had bearded the French general at Mount St. John. He had 1,000 anecdotes about the famous battles. He knew the position of every regiment and the loss which each had incurred. He did not deny that he had been concerned in those victories, that he had been with the army and carried dispatches for the Duke of Wellington. And he described what the Duke did and said on every conceivable moment of the day of Waterloo with such an accurate knowledge of his Grace's sentiments and proceedings that it was clear he must have been by the conqueror's side throughout the day, though, as a non-combatant, his name was not mentioned in the public documents relative to the battle. Perhaps he actually worked himself up to believe that he had been engaged with the army. Certain it is that he made a prodigious sensation for some time at Calcutta, and was called Waterloo Sedley during the whole of his subsequent stay in Bengal. The bills which Joss had given for the purchase of those unlucky horses were paid without question by him and his agents. He never was heard to allude to the bargain, and nobody knows for a certainty what became of the horses, or how he got rid of them, or of Isidore, his Belgian servant, who sold a grey horse, very like the one which Joss rode, at Valenciennes sometime during the autumn of 1815. Joss's London agents had orders to pay £120 yearly to his parents at Fulham. It was the chief support of the old couple, for Mr. Sedley's speculations in life subsequent to his bankruptcy did not by any means retrieve the broken old gentleman's fortune. He tried to be a wine merchant, a coal merchant, a commission lottery agent, etc., etc. He sent round prospectuses to his friends whenever he took a new trade, and ordered a new brass plate for the door, and talked pompously about making his fortune still. But fortune never came back to the feeble and stricken old man. One by one his friends dropped off, and were weary of buying dear coals and bad wine from him, and there was only his wife in all the world who fancied, when he tottered off to the city of a morning, that he was still doing any business there. At evening he crawled slowly back, and he used to go of nights to a little club at a tavern, where he disposed of the finances of the nation. It was wonderful to hear him talk about millions, and agios, and discounts, and what Rothschild was doing, and Baring Brothers. He talked of such vast sums that the gentlemen of the club, the apothecary, the undertaker, the great carpenter and builder, the parish clerk, who was allowed to come stealthily, and Mr. Clapp, our old acquaintance, respected the old gentleman. "I was better off once, sir," he did not fail to tell everybody who used the room. "My son, sir, is at this minute chief magistrate of Ramgunge in the presidency of Bengal, and touching his 4,000 rupees per mensem. My daughter might be a colonel's lady if she liked. I might draw upon my son, the first magistrate, sir, for £2,000 tomorrow, and Alexander would cash my bill down, sir, down on the counter, sir. But the Sedleys were always a proud family." You and I, my dear reader, may drop into this condition one day, for have not many of our friends attained it? Our luck may fail, our powers forsake us, our place on the boards be taken by better and younger mimes. The chance of life roll away and leave us shattered and stranded. Then men will walk across the road when they meet you, or, worse still, hold you out a couple of fingers and patronize you in a pitying way. Then you will know, as soon as your back is turned, that your friend begins with a "Poor devil, what imprudences he has committed, what chances that chap has thrown away." Well, well. A carriage and 3,000 a year is not the summit of the reward, nor the end of God's judgment of men. If quacks prosper as often as they go to the wall, if zanies succeed and knaves arrive at fortune, and vice versa, sharing ill luck and prosperity for all the world like the ablest and most honest among us, I say, brother, the gifts and pleasures of Vanity Fair cannot be held of any great account, and that it is probable. But we are wandering out of the domain of the story. Had Mrs. Sedley been a woman of energy, she would have exerted it after her husband's ruin, and, occupying a large house, would have taken in boarders. The broken Sedley would have acted well as the boarding-house landlady's husband, the Munoz of private life, the titular lord and master, the carver, house steward, and humble husband of the occupier of the dingy throne. I have seen men of good brains and breeding, and of good hopes and vigor once, who feasted squires and kept hunters in their youth, meekly cutting up legs of mutton for rancorous old harridans, and pretending to preside over their dreary tables. But Mrs. Sedley, we say, had not spirit enough to bustle about for a few select inmates to join a cheerful musical family, such as one reads of in the Times. She was content to lie on the shore where fortune had stranded her, and you could see that the career of this old couple was over. I don't think they were unhappy. Perhaps they were a little prouder in their downfall than in their prosperity. Mrs. Sedley was always a great person for her landlady, Mrs. Clapp, when she descended and passed many hours with her in the basement or ornamented kitchen. The Irish maid, Betty Flanagan's bonnets and ribbons, her sauciness, her idleness, her reckless prodigality of kitchen candles, her consumption of tea and sugar, and so forth, occupied and amused the old lady almost as much as the doings of her former household, when she had Sambo and the coachman and a groom and a footboy, and a housekeeper with a regiment of female domestics. Her former household, about which the good lady talked 100 times a day. And besides Betty Flanagan, Mrs. Sedley had all the maids of all work in the street to superintend. She knew how each tenant of the cottages paid or owed his little rent. She stepped aside when Mrs. Rougemont, the actress, passed with her dubious family. She flung up her head when Mrs. Pessler, the apothecary's lady, drove by in her husband's professional one-horse chaise. She had colloquies with the greengrocer about the pennorth of turnips which Mr. Sedley loved. She kept an eye upon the milkman and the baker's boy, and made visitations to the butcher, who sold hundreds of oxen, very likely with less ado than was made about Mrs. Sedley's loin of mutton. And she counted the potatoes under the joint on Sundays, on which days, dressed in her best, she went to church twice, and read Blair's sermons in the evening. On that day, for business prevented him on weekdays from taking such a pleasure, it was old Sedley's delight to take out his little grandson Georgy to the neighbouring parks or Kensington Gardens, to see the soldiers or to feed the ducks. Georgy loved the redcoats, and his grandpapa told him how his father had been a famous soldier, and introduced him to many sergeants and others with Waterloo medals on their breasts, to whom the old grandfather pompously presented the child as the son of Captain Osborne, of the who died gloriously on the glorious 18th. He has been known to treat some of these non-commissioned gentlemen to a glass of porter, and indeed, in their first Sunday walks, was disposed to spoil little Georgy, sadly gorging the boy with apples in Parliament, to the detriment of his health, until Amelia declared that George should never go out with his grandpapa unless the latter promised solemnly and on his honour not to give the child any cakes, lollipops, or stall produce whatever. Between Mrs. Sedley and her daughter there was a sort of coolness about this boy, and a secret jealousy. For one evening, in George's very early days, Amelia, who had been seated at work in their little parlour, scarcely remarking that the old lady had quitted the room, ran upstairs instinctively to the nursery at the cries of the child, who had been asleep until that moment, and there found Mrs. Sedley in the act of surreptitiously administering Daffy's elixir to the infant. Amelia, the gentlest and sweetest of everyday mortals, when she found this meddling with her maternal authority, thrilled and trembled all over with anger. Her cheeks, ordinarily pale, now flushed up until they were as red as they used to be when she was a child of 12 years old. She seized the baby out of her mother's arms, and then grasped at the bottle, leaving the old lady gaping at her, furious, and holding the guilty teaspoon. Amelia flung the bottle crashing into the fireplace. "I will not have baby poisoned, mamma," cried Emmy, rocking the infant about violently with both her arms round him, and turning with flashing eyes at her mother. "Poisoned, Amelia," said the old lady. "This language to me! He shall not have any medicine but that which Mr. Pessler sends for him. He told me that Daffy's elixir was poison." "Very good. You think I'm a murderess, then," replied Mrs. Sedley. "This is the language you use to your mother. I have met with misfortunes. I have sunk low in life. I have kept my carriage, and now walk on foot. But I did not know I was a murderess before, and thank you for the news." "Mamma," said the poor girl, who was always ready for tears, "you shouldn't be so hard upon me. I didn't mean I did not wish to say you would do any wrong to this dear child, only—" "Oh, no, my love, only that I was a murderess, in which case I had better go to the Old Bailey. Though I didn't poison you when you were a child, but gave you the best of education and the most expensive masters money could procure. Yes, I've nursed 5 children and buried 3, and the one I loved the best of all, and tended through croup, and teething, and measles, and whooping cough, and brought up with foreign masters, regardless of expense, and with accomplishments at Minerva House, which I never had when I was a girl, when I was too glad to honour my father and mother, that I might live long in the land, and to be useful, and not to mope all day in my room and act the fine lady, says I'm a murderess. Ah, Mrs. Osborne, may you never nourish a viper in your bosom, that's my prayer. Mamma, mamma, cried the bewildered girl, and the child in her arms set up a frantic chorus of shouts. A murderess indeed! Go down on your knees and pray to God to cleanse your wicked, ungrateful heart, Amelia, and may he forgive you as I do. And Mrs. Sedley tossed out of the room, hissing out the word poison once more, and so ending her charitable benediction. Till the termination of her natural life, this breach between Mrs. Sedley and her daughter was never thoroughly mended. The quarrel gave the elder lady numberless advantages which she did not fail to turn to account with female ingenuity and perseverance. For instance, she scarcely spoke to Amelia for many weeks afterwards. She warned the domestics not to touch the child, as Mrs. Osborne might be offended. She asked her daughter to see and satisfy herself that there was no poison prepared in the little daily messes that were concocted for Georgy. When neighbours asked after the boy's health, she referred them pointedly to Mrs. Osborne. She never ventured to ask whether the baby was well or not. She would not touch the child, although he was her grandson and own precious darling, for she was not used to children, and might kill it. And whenever Mr. Pestler came up upon his healing inquisition, she received the doctor with such a sarcastic and scornful demeanour as made the surgeon declare that not Lady Thistlewood herself, whom he had the great honour of attending professionally, could give herself greater airs than old Mrs. Sedley, from whom he never took a fee. And very likely Emmy was jealous too, upon her own part, as what mother is not, of those who would manage her children for her, or become candidates for the first place in their affections. It is certain that when anybody nursed the child she was uneasy, and that she would no more allow Mrs. Clapp or the domestic to dress or tend him than she would have let them wash her husband's miniature, which hung up over her little bed, the same little bed from which the poor girl had gone to his, and to which she retired now for many long, silent, tearful, but happy years. In this room was all Amelia's heart and treasure. Here it was that she tended her boy, and watched him through the many ills of childhood, with a constant passion of love. The elder George returned in him somehow, only improved, and as if come back from heaven. In 100 little tones, looks, and movements, the child was so like his father that the widow's heart thrilled as she held him to it, and he would often ask the cause of her tears. It was because of his likeness to his father she did not scruple to tell him. She talked constantly to him about this dead father, and spoke of her love for George to the innocent and wondering child, much more than she ever had done to George himself, or to any confidant of her youth. To her parents she never talked about this matter, shrinking from baring her heart to them. Little George very likely could understand no better than they, but into his ears she poured her sentimental secrets unreservedly, and into his only. The very joy of this woman was a sort of grief, or so tender at least that its expression was tears. Her sensibilities were so weak and tremulous that perhaps they ought not to be talked about in a book. I was told by Dr. Pestler, now a most flourishing ladies' physician, with a sumptuous dark green carriage, a prospect of speedy knighthood, and a house in Manchester Square, that her grief at weaning the child was a sight that would have unmanned a Herod. He was very soft-hearted many years ago, and his wife was mortally jealous of Mrs. Amelia, then and long afterwards. Perhaps the doctor's lady had good reason for her jealousy. Most women shared it, of those who formed the small circle of Amelia's acquaintance, and were quite angry at the enthusiasm with which the other sex regarded her. For almost all men who came near her loved her, though no doubt they would be at a loss to tell you why. She was not brilliant, nor witty, nor wise overmuch, nor extraordinarily handsome, but wherever she went, she touched and charmed every one of the male sex as invariably as she awakened the scorn and incredulity of her own sisterhood. I think it was her weakness which was her principal charm, a kind of sweet submission and softness, which seemed to appeal to each man she met for his sympathy and protection. We have seen how in the regiment, though she spoke but to few of George's comrades there, all of the swords of the young fellows at the mess table would have leapt from their scabbards to fight round her. And so it was in the little narrow lodging-house and circle at Fulham. She interested and pleased everybody. If she had been Mrs. Mango herself, of the great house of Mango, Plantain, and Co., Crutched Friars, and the magnificent proprietress of the Pineries, Fulham, who gave summer déjeuners frequented by dukes and earls, and drove about the parish with magnificent yellow liveries and bay horses, such as the royal stables at Kensington themselves could not turn out. I say, had she been Mrs. Mango herself, or her son's wife, Lady Mary Mango, daughter of the Earl of Castlemouldy, who condescended to marry the head of the firm, the tradesmen of the neighborhood could not pay her more honor than they invariably showed to the gentle young widow when she passed by their doors or made her humble purchases at their shops. Thus it was not only Mr. Pessler, the medical man, but Mr. Linton, the young assistant, who doctored the servant maids and small tradesmen, and might be seen any day reading the Times in the surgery, who openly declared himself the slave of Mrs. Osborne. He was a personable young gentleman, more welcome at Mrs. Sedley's lodgings than his principal, and if anything went wrong with Georgy, he would drop in twice or thrice in the day to see the little chap, and without so much as the thought of a fee. He would abstract lozenges, tamarinds, and other produce from the surgery drawers for little Georgy's benefit, and compounded draughts and mixtures for him of miraculous sweetness, so that it was quite a pleasure to the child to be ailing. He and Pessler, his chief, sat up 2 whole nights by the boy in that momentous and awful week when Georgy had the measles, and when you would have thought, from the mother's terror, that there had never been measles in the world before. Would they have done as much for other people? Did they sit up for the folks at the Pineries, when Ralph Plantagenet, and Gwendolen, and Guinevere Mango had the same juvenile complaint? Did they sit up for little Mary Clapp, the landlord's daughter, who actually caught the disease of little Georgy? Truth compels one to say no. They slept quite undisturbed, at least as far as she was concerned, pronounced hers to be a slight case, which would almost cure itself, sent her in a draught or two, and threw in bark when the child rallied, with perfect indifference, and just for form's sake. Again, there was the little French chevalier opposite, who gave lessons in his native tongue at various schools in the neighborhood, and who might be heard in his apartment of nights playing tremulous old gavottes and minuets on a wheezy old fiddle. Whenever this powdered and courteous old man, who never missed a Sunday at the convent chapel at Hammersmith, and who was in all respects, thoughts, conduct, and bearing utterly unlike the bearded savages of his nation, who curse perfidious Albion and scowl at you from over their cigars, in the Quadrant arcades at the present day. Whenever the old Chevalier de Talon Rouge spoke of Mistress Osborne, he would first finish his pinch of snuff, flick away the remaining particles of dust with a graceful wave of his hand, gather up his fingers into a bunch, and bringing them up to his mouth, blow them open with a kiss, exclaiming, "Ah, la divine créature!" He vowed and protested that when Amelia walked in the Brompton lanes, flowers grew in profusion under her feet. He called little Georgy Cupid, and asked him news of Venus, his mamma, and told the astonished Betty Flanagan that she was one of the Graces, and the favorite attendant of the Reine des Amours. Instances might be multiplied of this easily gained and unconscious popularity. Did not Mr. Binney, the mild and genteel curate of the district chapel which the family attended, call assiduously upon the widow, dandle the little boy on his knee, and offer to teach him Latin, to the anger of the elderly virgin, his sister, who kept house for him? "There is nothing in her, Bailby," the latter lady would say. "When she comes to tea here, she does not speak a word during the whole evening. She is but a poor lackadaisical creature, and it is my belief has no heart at all. It is only her pretty face which all you gentlemen admire so. Miss Grits, who has £5,000, and expectations besides, has twice as much character, and is 1,000 times more agreeable to my taste. And if she were good-looking, I know that you would think her perfection." Very likely Miss Binney was right to a great extent. It is the pretty face which creates sympathy in the hearts of men, those wicked rogues. A woman may possess the wisdom and chastity of Minerva, and we give no heed to her if she has a plain face. What folly will not a pair of bright eyes make pardonable? What dullness may not red lips and sweet accents render pleasant? And so, with their usual sense of justice, ladies argue that because a woman is handsome, therefore she is a fool. Oh, ladies, ladies, there are some of you who are neither handsome nor wise. These are but trivial incidents to recount in the life of our heroine. Her tale does not deal in wonders, as the gentle reader has already, no doubt, perceived, and if a journal had been kept of her proceedings during the 7 years after the birth of her son, there would be found few incidents more remarkable in it than that of the measles, recorded in the foregoing page. Yes, one day, and greatly to her wonder, the Reverend Mr. Binney, just mentioned, asked her to change her name of Osborne for his own, when, with deep blushes and tears in her eyes and voice, she thanked him for his regard for her, expressed gratitude for his attentions to her and to her poor little boy, but said that she never, never could think of any but the husband whom she had lost. On the 25th of April and the 18th of June, the days of marriage and widowhood, she kept her room entirely, consecrating them, and we do not know how many hours of solitary night thought, her little boy sleeping in his crib by her bedside, to the memory of that departed friend. During the day she was more active. She had to teach George to read and to write, and a little to draw. She read books, in order that she might tell him stories from them. As his eyes opened and his mind expanded under the influence of the outward nature round about him, she taught the child, to the best of her humble power, to acknowledge the Maker of all, and every night and every morning he and she, in that awful and touching communion which I think must bring a thrill to the heart of every man who witnesses or who remembers it, the mother and the little boy, prayed to our Father together, the mother pleading with all her gentle heart, the child lisping after her as she spoke. And each time they prayed to God to bless dear papa as if he were alive and in the room with them. To wash and dress this young gentleman, to take him for a run of the mornings before breakfast, and the retreat of grandpapa for business, to make for him the most wonderful and ingenious dresses, for which end the thrifty widow cut up and altered every available little bit of finery which she possessed, out of her wardrobe during her marriage. For Mrs. Osborne herself, greatly to her mother's vexation, who preferred fine clothes, especially since her misfortunes, always wore a black gown and a straw bonnet with a black ribbon, occupied her many hours of the day. Others she had to spare, at the service of her mother and her old father. She had taken the pains to learn, and used to play cribbage with this gentleman on the nights when he did not go to his club. She sang for him when he was so minded, and it was a good sign, for he invariably fell into a comfortable sleep during the music. She wrote out his numerous memorials, letters, prospectuses, and projects. It was in her handwriting that most of the old gentleman's former acquaintances were informed that he had become an agent for the Black Diamond and Anti-Cinder Coal Company, and could supply his friends and the public with the best coal at shillings per cauldron. All he did was to sign the circulars with his flourish and signature, and direct them in a shaky clerk-like hand. One of these papers was sent to Major Dobbin, Regiment, care of Monsieur Cox and Greenwood, but the Major being in Madras at the time had no particular call for coals. He knew, though, the hand which had written the prospectus. Good God, what would he not have given to hold it in his own? A second prospectus came out, informing the Major that J. Sedley and Company, having established agencies at Oporto, Bordeaux, and St. Mary's, were enabled to offer to their friends and the public generally the finest and most celebrated growths of ports, sherries, and claret wines at reasonable prices and under extraordinary advantages. Acting upon this hint, Dobbin furiously canvassed the governor, the commander-in-chief, the judges, the regiments, and everybody whom he knew in the presidency, and sent home to Sedley and Company orders for wine which perfectly astonished Mr. Sedley and Mr. Clapp, who was the company in the business. But no more orders came after that first burst of good fortune, on which poor old Sedley was about to build a house in the city, a regiment of clerks, a dock to himself, and correspondence all over the world. The old gentleman's former taste in wine had gone. The curses of the mess-room assailed Major Dobbin for the vile drinks he had been the means of introducing there, and he bought back a great quantity of the wine and sold it at public outcry, at an enormous loss to himself. As for Joss, who was by this time promoted to a seat at the Revenue Board at Calcutta, he was wild with rage when the post brought him out a bundle of these bacchanalian prospectuses, with a private note from his father telling Joss that his senior counted upon him in this enterprise, and had consigned a quantity of select wines to him, as per invoice, drawing bills upon him for the amount of the same. Joss, who would no more have it supposed that his father, Joss Sedley's father, of the Board of Revenue was a wine merchant asking for orders, then he was Jack Ketch, refused the bills with scorn, wrote back contumeliously to the old gentleman, bidding him to mind his own affairs, and the protested paper coming back, Sedley and Company had to take it up, with the profits which they had made out of the Madras venture, and with a little portion of Emmy's savings. Besides her pension of £50 a year, there had been £500, as her husband's executor stated, left in the agent's hands at the time of Osborne's demise, which sum, as George's guardian, Dobbin proposed to put out at 8% in an Indian house of agency. Mr. Sedley, who thought the Major had some roguish intentions of his own about the money, was strongly against this plan, and he went to the agents to protest personally against the employment of the money in question, when he learned, to his surprise, that there had been no such sum in their hands, that all the late captain's assets did not amount to £100, and that the £500 in question must be a separate sum, of which Major Dobbin knew the particulars. More than ever convinced that there was some roguery, old Sedley pursued the Major. As his daughter's nearest friend, he demanded with a high hand a statement of the late captain's accounts. Dobbin's stammering, blushing, and awkwardness added to the other's convictions that he had a rogue to deal with, and in a majestic tone he told that officer a piece of his mind, as he called it, simply stating his belief that the Major was unlawfully detaining his late son-in-law's money. Dobbin at this lost all patience, and if his accuser had not been so old and so broken, a quarrel might have ensued between them at the Slaughter's coffee-house, in a box of which place of entertainment the gentlemen had their colloquy. "Come upstairs, sir," lisped out the Major. "I insist on your coming up the stairs, and I will show which is the injured party, poor George or I." And dragging the old gentleman up to his bedroom, he produced from his desk Osborne's account, and a bundle of IOUs which the latter had given, who, to do him justice, was always ready to give an IOU. "He paid his bills in England," Dobbin added, "but he had not £100 in the world when he fell. I and one or two of his brother officers made up the little sum, which was all that we could spare, and you dare tell us that we are trying to cheat the widow and the orphan." Sedley was very contrite and humbled, though the fact is that William Dobbin had told a great falsehood to the old gentleman, having himself given every shilling of the money, having buried his friend, and paid all the fees and charges incident upon the calamity and removal of poor Amelia. About these expenses old Osborne had never given himself any trouble to think, nor any other relative of Amelia, nor Amelia herself, indeed. She trusted to Major Dobbin as an accountant, took his somewhat confused calculations for granted, and never once suspected how much she was in his debt. Twice or thrice in the year, according to her promise, she wrote him letters to Madras, letters all about little Georgy. How he treasured these papers! Whenever Amelia wrote, he answered, and not until then. But he sent over endless remembrances of himself to his godson and to her. He ordered and sent a box of scarves, and a grand ivory set of chessmen from China. The pawns were little green and white men, with real swords and shields. The knights were on horseback, the castles were on the backs of elephants. "Mrs. Mango's own set at the Pineries was not so fine," Mr. Pestler remarked. These chessmen were the delight of Georgy's life, who printed his first letter in acknowledgment of this gift of his godpapa. He sent over preserves and pickles, which latter the young gentleman tried surreptitiously in the sideboard, and half killed himself with eating. He thought it was a judgment upon him for stealing, they were so hot. Emmy wrote a comical little account of this mishap to the Major. It pleased him to think her spirits were rallying and that she could be merry sometimes now. He sent over a pair of shawls, a white one for her, and a black one with palm leaves for her mother, and a pair of red scarves, as winter wrappers, for old Mr. Sedley and George. The shawls were worth 50 guineas apiece at the very least, as Mrs. Sedley knew. She wore hers in state at church at Brompton, and was congratulated by her female friends upon the splendid acquisition. Emmy's, too, became prettily her modest black gown. "What a pity it is she won't think of him," Mrs. Sedley remarked to Mrs. Clapp, and to all her friends of Brompton. "Joss never sent us such presents, I'm sure, and grudges us everything. It is evident that the Major is over head and ears in love with her, and yet, whenever I so much as hint it, she turns red and begins to cry, and goes and sits upstairs with her miniature. I'm sick of that miniature. I wish we had never seen those odious purse-proud Osbornes." Amidst such humble scenes and associations, George's early youth was passed, and the boy grew up delicate, sensitive, imperious, woman-bred, domineering the gentle mother whom he loved with passionate affection. He ruled all the rest of the little world round about him. As he grew, the elders were amazed at his haughty manner, and his constant likeness to his father. He asked questions about everything, as inquiring youth will do. The profundity of his remarks and interrogatories astonished his old grandfather, who perfectly bored the club at the tavern with stories about the little lad's learning and genius. He suffered his grandmother with a good-humored indifference. The small circle round about him believed that the equal of the boy did not exist upon the earth. Georgy inherited his father's pride, and perhaps thought they were not wrong. When he grew to be about 6 years old, Dobbin began to write to him very much. The major wanted to hear that Georgy was going to a school, and hoped he would acquit himself with credit there. Or would he have a good tutor at home? It was time that he should begin to learn, and his godfather and guardian hinted that he hoped to be allowed to defray the charges of the boy's education, which would fall heavily upon his mother's straitened income. The major, in a word, was always thinking about Amelia and her little boy, and by orders to his agents kept the latter provided with picture books, paint boxes, desks, and all conceivable implements of amusement and instruction. 3 days before George's 6th birthday, a gentleman in a gig, accompanied by a servant, drove up to Mr. Sedley's house and asked to see Master George Osborne. It was Mr. Woolsey, military tailor, of Conduit Street, who came at the major's order to measure the young gentleman for a suit of clothes. He had had the honor of making for the captain, the young gentleman's father. Sometimes, too, and by the major's desire, no doubt, his sisters, the Misses Dobbin, would call in at the family carriage to take Amelia and the little boy to drive if they were so inclined. The patronage and kindness of these ladies was very uncomfortable to Amelia, but she bore it meekly enough, for her nature was to yield. And besides, the carriage and its splendors gave little Georgy immense pleasure. The ladies begged occasionally that the child might pass a day with them, and he was always glad to go to that fine garden house at Denmark Hill where they lived, and where there were such fine grapes in the hothouses and peaches on the walls. One day they kindly came over to Amelia with news which they were sure would delight her, something very interesting about their dear William. What was it? Was he coming home? She asked, with pleasure beaming in her eyes. Oh, no, not the least. But they had very good reason to believe that dear William was about to be married, and to a relation of a very dear friend of Amelia's, to Miss Glorvina O'Dowd, Sir Michael O'Dowd's sister, who had gone out to join Lady O'Dowd at Madras, a very beautiful and accomplished girl, everybody said. Amelia said, "Oh!" Amelia was very, very happy indeed, but she supposed Glorvina could not be like her old acquaintance, who was most kind, but she was very happy indeed. And by some impulse of which I cannot explain the meaning, she took George in her arms and kissed him with an extraordinary tenderness. Her eyes were quite moist when she put the child down, and she scarcely spoke a word during the whole of the drive, though she was so very happy indeed. End of chapter 38.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kim Zuckert. Tales of the Brass Hedgehog, hedgehog.net. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 39. A Cynical Chapter. Our duty now takes us back for a brief space to some old Hampshire acquaintances of ours, whose hopes respecting the disposal of their rich kinswoman's property were so woefully disappointed. After counting upon £30,000 from his sister, it was a heavy blow to Bute Crawley to receive but 5, out of which sum, when he had paid his own debts and those of Jim, his son at college, a very small fragment remained to portion off his 4 plain daughters. Mrs. Bute never knew, or at least never acknowledged, how far her own tyrannous behavior had tended to ruin her husband. All that woman could do, she vowed and protested, she had done. Was it her fault if she did not possess those sycophantic arts which her hypocritical nephew, Pitt Crawley, practised? She wished him all the happiness which he merited out of his ill-gotten gains. "At least the money will remain in the family," she said charitably. Pitt will never spend it, my dear, that is quite certain, for a greater miser does not exist in England, and he is as odious, though in a different way, as his spendthrift brother, the abandoned Rawdon." So Mrs. Bute, after the first shock of rage and disappointment, began to accommodate herself as best she could to her altered fortunes, and to save and retrench with all her might. She instructed her daughters how to bear poverty cheerfully, and invented 1,000 notable methods to conceal or evade it. She took them about to balls and public places in the neighbourhood with praiseworthy energy. Nay, she entertained her friends in a hospitable, comfortable manner at the rectory, and much more frequently than before dear Miss Crawley's legacy had fallen in. From her outward bearing, nobody would have supposed that the family had been disappointed in their expectations, or have guessed from her frequent appearance in public how she pinched and starved at home. Her girls had more milliner's furniture than they had ever enjoyed before. They appeared perseveringly at the Winchester and Southampton assemblies. They penetrated to Cowes for the race balls and regatta gaieties there, and their carriage, with the horses taken from the plough, was at work perpetually, until it began almost to be believed that the four sisters had had fortunes left them by their aunt, whose name the family never mentioned in public, but with the most tender gratitude and regard. I know no sort of lying which is more frequent in Vanity Fair than this, and it may be remarked how people who practice it take credit to themselves for their hypocrisy, and fancy that they are exceedingly virtuous and praiseworthy, because they are able to deceive the world with regard to the extent of their means. Mrs. Bute certainly thought herself one of the most virtuous women in England, and the sight of her happy family was an edifying one to strangers. They were so cheerful, so loving, so well educated, so simple. Martha painted flowers exquisitely, and furnished half the charity bazaars in the county. Emma was a regular county bulbul, and her verses in the Hampshire Telegraph were the glory of its poet's corner. Fanny and Matilda sang duets together, mamma playing the piano, and the other two sisters sitting with their arms round each other's waists and listening affectionately. Nobody saw the poor girls drumming at the duets in private. No one saw mamma drilling them rigidly hour after hour. In a word, Mrs. Bute put a good face against fortune, and kept up appearances in the most virtuous manner. Everything that a good and respectable mother could do, Mrs. Bute did. She got over yachting men from Southampton, parsons from the cathedral close at Winchester, and officers from the barracks there. She tried to inveigle the young barristers at assizes, and encouraged Jim to bring home friends with whom he went out hunting with the H.H. What will not a mother do for the benefit of her beloved ones? Between such a woman and her brother-in-law, the odious baronet at the Hall, it is manifest that there could be very little in common. The rupture between Bute and his brother Sir Pitt was complete. Indeed, between Sir Pitt and the whole county, to which the old man was a scandal. His dislike for respectable society increased with age, and the lodge gates had not opened to a gentleman's carriage wheels since Pitt and Lady Jane came to pay their visit of duty after their marriage. That was an awful and unfortunate visit, never to be thought of by the family without horror. Pitt begged his wife, with a ghastly countenance, never to speak of it, and it was only through Mrs. Bute herself, who still knew everything which took place at the Hall, that the circumstances of Sir Pitt's reception of his son and daughter-in-law were ever known at all. As they drove up the avenue of the park in their neat and well-appointed carriage, Pitt remarked with dismay and wrath great gaps among the trees, his trees, which the old baronet was felling entirely without license. The park wore an aspect of utter dreariness and ruin. The drives were ill-kept, and the neat carriage splashed and floundered in muddy pools along the road. The great sweep in front of the terrace and entrance stair was black and covered with mosses, the once trim flower beds rank and weedy. Shutters were up along almost the whole line of the house. The great hall door was unbarred after much ringing of the bell. An individual in ribbons was seen flitting up the black oak stair, as Horrocks at length admitted the heir of Queen's Crawley and his bride into the halls of their fathers. He led the way into Sir Pitt's library, as it was called, the fumes of tobacco growing stronger as Pitt and Lady Jane approached that apartment. "Sir Pitt ain't very well," Horrocks remarked apologetically, and hinted that his master was afflicted with lumbago. The library looked out on the front walk and park. Sir Pitt had opened one of the windows, and was bawling out thence to the postilion and Pitt's servant, who seemed to be about to take the baggage down. Don't move none of them trunks, he cried, pointing with a pipe which he held in his hand. It's only a morning visit, Tucker, you fool. Law, what cracks that off horse has in his heels? Ain't there no one at the King's Head to rub him a little? How do, Pitt? How do, my dear? Come to see the old man, eh? Gad, you've got a pretty face, too. You ain't like that old horse godmother, your mother. Come and give old Pitt a kiss like a good little gal. The embrace disconcerted the daughter-in-law somewhat, as the caresses of the old man, unshorn and perfumed with tobacco, might well do, but she remembered that her brother Southdown had mustachios and smoked cigars, and submitted to the baronet with a tolerable grace. "Pitt has got that," said the baronet, after this mark of affection. "Does he read very long sermons, my dear? 100th Psalm, evening hymn, eh, Pitt? Go and get a glass of Malmsey and a cake for my Lady Jane, Horrocks, you great big booby, and don't stand staring there like a fat pig. I won't ask you to stop, my dear, you'll find it too stupid, and so should I too along a Pitt. I'm an old man now, I like me ways and me pipe and backgammon of a night." "I can play at backgammon, sir," said Lady Jane, laughing. "I used to play with papa and Miss Crawley, didn't I, Mr. Crawley?" "Lady Jane can play, sir, at the game to which you state that you are so partial," Pitt said haughtily. "But she wouldn't stop for all that. No, no, go back to Mudbury and give Mrs. Rincer a benefit, or drive down to the rectory and ask Beauty for a dinner. He'll be charmed to see you, you know. He's so much obliged to you for getting the old woman's money. Some of it will do to patch up the hall when I'm gone." "I perceive, sir," said Pitt, with a heightened voice, "that your people will cut down the timber." "Yes, yes, very fine weather, and seasonable for the time of year," Sir Pitt answered, who had suddenly grown deaf. "But I'm getting old, Pitt, now. Law bless ye, he ain't far from 50 yourself, but he wears well, my pretty Lady Jane, doesn't he? It's all godliness, sobriety, and a moral life. Look at me, I'm not very far from fourscore." And he laughed and took snuff and leered at her and pinched her hand. Pitt once more brought the conversation back to the timber, but the baronet was deaf again in an instant. "I'm getting very old, and have been cruel bad this year with the lumbago. I shan't be here now for long, but I'm glad you've come, daughter-in-law. I like your face, Lady Jane. It's got none of the damned high-boned binky look in it, and I'll give you something pretty, my dear, to go to court in." And he shuffled across the room to a cupboard, from which he took a little old case containing jewels of some value. "Take that," said he, "my dear. It belonged to my mother, and afterwards to the first Lady Binkie. Pretty pearls. Never gave 'em the ironmonger's daughter. No, no. Take 'em and put 'em up quick," said he, thrusting the case into his daughter's hand, and clapping the door of the cabinet to, as Horrocks entered with a salver and refreshments. "What have you been a-giving Pitt's wife?" said the individual in ribbons, when Pitt and Lady Jane had taken leave of the old gentleman. It was Miss Horrocks, the butler's daughter, the cause of the scandal throughout the county, the lady who reigned now almost supreme at Queen's Crawley. The rise and progress of those ribbons had been marked with dismay by the county and family. The ribbons opened an account at the Mudbury Branch Savings Bank. The ribbons drove to church, monopolizing the pony chaise, which was for the use of the servants at the Hall. The domestics were dismissed at her pleasure. The Scotch gardener, who still lingered on the premises, taking a pride in his walls and hothouses, and indeed making a pretty good livelihood by the garden, which he farmed and of which he sold the produce at Southampton, found the ribbons eating peaches on a sunshiny morning at the south wall, and had his ears boxed when he remonstrated about this attack on his property. He and his Scotch wife and his Scotch children were forced to migrate with their goods and their chattels, and left the stately, comfortable gardens to go to waste, and the flower beds to run to seed. Poor Lady Crawley's rose garden became the dreariest wilderness. Only 2 or 3 domestics shuddered in the bleak old servants' hall. The stables and offices were vacant and shut up and half ruined. Sir Pitt lived in private, and boozed nightly with Horrocks, his butler or house steward, as he now began to be called, and the abandoned ribbons. The times were very much changed since the periods when she drove to Mudbury in the spring cart and called the small tradesmen "sir." It may have been shame, or it may have been dislike of his neighbours, but the old cynic of Queen's Crawley hardly issued from his park gates at all now. He quarrelled with his agents, and screwed his tenants by letter. His days were passed in conducting his own correspondence. The lawyers and farm bailiffs who had to do business with him could not reach him but through the ribbons, who received them at the door of the housekeeper's room, which commanded the back entrance by which they were admitted, and so the baronet's daily perplexities increased, and his embarrassments multiplied round him. The horror of Pitt Crawley may be imagined, as these reports of his father's dotage reached the most exemplary and correct of gentlemen. He trembled daily lest he should hear that Ribbons was proclaimed his second legal mother-in-law. After that first and last visit, his father's name was never mentioned in Pitt's polite and genteel establishment. It was the skeleton in his house, and all the family walked by it in terror and silence. The Countess Southdown kept on dropping per coach at the lodge gate the most exciting tracts which ought to frighten the hair off your head. Mrs. Bute at the parsonage nightly looked out to see if the sky was red over the elms behind which the hall stood, and the mansion was on fire. Sir G. Wapshot and Sir H. Fuddleston, old friends of the house, wouldn't sit on the bench with Sir Pitt at quarter sessions, and cut him dead in the High Street of Southampton, where the reprobate stood, offering his dirty old hands to them. Nothing had any effect on him. He put his hands into his pockets and burst out laughing as he scrambled into his carriage and four. He used to burst out laughing at Lady Southdown's tracts, and he laughed at his sons, and at the world, and at the Ribbons when she was angry, which was not seldom. Miss Horrocks was installed as housekeeper at Queen's Crawley, and ruled all the domestics there with great majesty and rigour. All the servants were instructed to address her as mum or madam, and there was one little maid, on her promotion, who persisted in calling her my lady, without any rebuke on the part of the housekeeper. "There has been better ladies, and there has been worse, Hester," was Miss Horrocks' reply to this compliment of her inferior. So she ruled, having supreme power over all except her father, whom, however, she treated with considerable haughtiness, warning him not to be too familiar in his behaviour to one "as was to be a baronet's lady." Indeed, she rehearsed that exalted part in life with great satisfaction to herself, and to the amusement of old Sir Pitt, who chuckled at her airs and graces, and would laugh by the hour together at her assumptions of dignity and imitations of genteel life. He swore it was as good as a play to see her in the character of a fine dame, and he made her put on one of the First Lady Crawley's court dresses, swearing, entirely to Miss Horrocks' own concurrence, that the dress became her prodigiously, and threatening to drive her off that very instant to court in a coach and four. She had the ransacking of the wardrobes of the two defunct ladies, and cut and hacked their posthumous finery so as to suit her own tastes and figure. And she would have liked to take possession of their jewels and trinkets too, but the old baronet had locked them away in his private cabinet, nor could she coax or wheedle him out of the keys. And it is a fact that some time after she left Queen's Crawley, a copy-book belonging to this lady was discovered, which showed that she had taken great pains in private to learn the art of writing in general, and especially of writing her own name, as Lady Crawley, Lady Betsy Horrocks, Lady Elizabeth Crawley, etc. Though the good people of the parsonage never went to the hall, and shunned the horrid old dotard its owner, yet they kept a strict knowledge of all that happened there, and were looking out every day for the catastrophe for which Miss Horrocks was also eager. But fate intervened enviously, and prevented her from receiving the reward due such immaculate love and virtue. One day the baronet surprised her ladyship, as he jocularly called her, seated at that old and tuneless piano in the drawing-room, which had scarcely been touched since Becky Sharp played quadrilles upon it, seated at the piano with the utmost gravity, and squalling to the best of her power in imitation of the music which she had sometimes heard. The little kitchen-maid, on her promotion, was standing at her mistress's side, quite delighted during the operation, and wagging her head up and down, and crying, "Lo, mum, 'tis beautiful!" just like a genteel sycophant in a real drawing-room. This incident made the old baronet roar with laughter as usual. He narrated the circumstance a dozen times to Horrocks in the course of the evening, and greatly to the discomfiture of Miss Horrocks. He thrummed on the table as if it had been a musical instrument, and squalled in imitation of her manner of singing. He vowed that such a beautiful voice ought to be cultivated, and declared she ought to have singing masters, in which proposals she saw nothing ridiculous. He was in great spirits that night, and drank with his friend and butler an extraordinary quantity of rum and water, at a very late hour, the faithful friend and domestic conducted his master to his bedroom. Half an hour afterwards there was a great hurry and bustle in the house. Lights went about from window to window in the lonely, desolate old hall, whereof but 2 or 3 rooms were ordinarily occupied by its owner. Presently a boy on a pony went galloping off to Mudbury, to the doctor's house there, and in another hour, by which fact we ascertain how carefully the excellent Mrs. Bute Crawley had always kept up an understanding with the great house, that lady in her clogs and calash, the Reverend Bute Crawley, and James Crawley, her son, had walked over from the rectory through the park, and had entered the mansion by the open hall door. They passed through the hall and the small oak parlour, on the table of which stood the 3 tumblers and the empty rum bottle which had served for Sir Pitt's carouse, and through that apartment into Sir Pitt's study, where they found Miss Horrocks, of the guilty ribbons, with a wild air, trying at the presses and escritoires with a bunch of keys. She dropped them with a scream of horror, as little Mrs. Bute's eyes flashed out at her from under her black calash. "Look at that, James and Mr. Crawley!" cried Mrs. Bute, pointing at the scared figure of the black-eyed, guilty wench. "He gave 'em me! He gave 'em me!" she cried. "Gave 'em you, you abandoned creature!" screamed Mrs. Bute. "Bear witness, Mr. Crawley, we found this good-for-nothing woman in the act of stealing your brother's property, and she will be hanged, as I always said she would." Betsy Horrocks, quite daunted, flung herself down on her knees, bursting into tears. But those who know a really good woman are aware that she is not in a hurry to forgive, and that the humiliation of an enemy is a triumph to her soul. "Ring the bell, James," Mrs. Bute said. "Go on ringing till the people come." The 3 or 4 domestics resident in the deserted old house came presently at that jangling and continued summons. "Put that woman in the strong room," she said. "We caught her in the act of robbing Sir Pitt. Mr. Crawley, you'll make out her committal, and Beddoes, you'll drive her over in the spring cart in the morning to Southampton Gaol." "My dear," interposed the magistrate and rector, "she's only—" "Are there no handcuffs?" Mrs. Bute continued, stamping in her clogs. "There used to be handcuffs. Where's the creature's abominable father?" "He did give 'em me," still cried poor Betsy. "Didn't he, Hester? You saw Sir Pitt, you know you did give 'em me ever so long ago, the day after Mudbury Fair. Not that I want 'em, take 'em if you think they ain't mine." And here the unhappy wretch pulled out from her pocket a large pair of paste shoe buckles, which had excited her admiration, and which she had just appropriated out of one of the bookcases in the study, where they had lain. "Law, Betsy, how could you go for to tell such a wicked story?" said Hester, the little kitchen maid late on her promotion. "And to Madame Crawley, so good and kind, and his reverence," with a curtsy. "And you may search all my boxes, mum, I'm sure, and here's my keys as I'm an honest girl, though of poor parents and workhouse bred, and if you find so much as a beggarly bit of lace or a silk stocking out of all the gowns as you've got the picking of, may I never go to church again." "Give up the keys, you hardened hussy," hissed out the virtuous little lady in the calash. "And here's a candle, mum, if you please, mum. I can show you a room, mum, and the press in the housekeeper's room, mum, where she keeps heaps and heaps of things, mum," cried out the eager little Hester, with a profusion of curtsies. "Hold your tongue, if you please. I know the room which the creature occupies perfectly well. Mrs. Brown, have the goodness to come with me, and Beddoes, don't you lose sight of that woman," said Mrs. Bute, seizing the candle. "Mr. Crawley, you had better go upstairs and see that they are not murdering your unfortunate brother." And the calash, escorted by Mrs. Brown, walked away to the apartment which, as she said truly, she knew perfectly well. Bute went upstairs and found the doctor from Mudbury with the frightened Horrocks over his master in a chair. They were trying to bleed Sir Pitt Crawley. With the early morning, an express was sent off to Mr. Pitt Crawley by the rector's lady, who assumed the command of everything, and had watched the old baronet through the night. He had been brought back to a sort of life. He could not speak, but seemed to recognize people. Mrs. Bute kept resolutely by his bedside. She never seemed to want sleep, that little woman, and did not close her fiery black eyes once, though the doctor snored in the armchair. Horrocks made some wild efforts to assert his authority and assist his master, but Mrs. Bute called him a tipsy old wretch, and bade him never show his face again in that house, or he should be transported like his abominable daughter. Terrified by her manner, he slunk down to the oak parlour where Mr. James was, who, having tried the bottle standing there, and found no liquor in it, ordered Mr. Horrocks to Get another bottle of rum," which he fetched with clean glasses, and to which the rector and his son sat down, ordering Horrocks to put down the keys at that instant and never to show his face again. Cowed by this behaviour, Horrocks gave up the keys, and he and his daughter slunk off silently through the night and gave up possession of the house of Queen's Crawley. End of chapter 39.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bethany Simpson. Vanity Fair, Chapter 40, in which Becky is recognized by the family. The heir of Crawley arrived at home in due time after this catastrophe, and henceforth may be said to have reigned in Queen's Crawley. For though the old baronet survived many months, he never recovered the use of his intellect or his speech completely, and the government of the estate devolved upon his elder son. In a strange condition Pitt found it. Sir Pitt was always buying and mortgaging. He had 20 men of business, and quarrels with each, quarrels with all his tenants, and lawsuits with them, lawsuits with the lawyers, lawsuits with the mining and dock companies in which he was proprietor, and with every person with whom he had business. To unravel these difficulties and to set the estate clear was a task worthy of the orderly and persevering diplomatist of Pumpernickel, and he set himself to work with prodigious assiduity. His whole family, of course, was transported to Queen's Crawley, whither Lady Southdown, of course, came too, and she set about converting the parish under the rector's nose, and brought down her irregular clergy to the dismay of the angry Mrs. Bute. Sir Pitt had concluded no bargain for the sale of the living of Queen's Crawley. When it should drop, her ladyship proposed to take the patronage into her own hands, and present a young protégé to the rectory, on which subject the diplomatic Pitt said nothing. Mrs. Bute's intentions with regard to Miss Betsy Horrocks were not carried into effect, and she paid no visit to Southampton jail. She and her father left the Hall when the latter took possession of the Crawley Arms in the village, of which he had got a lease from Sir Pitt. The ex-butler had obtained a small freehold there likewise, which gave him a vote for the borough. The rector had another of these votes, and these and 4 others formed the representative body which returned the 2 members for Queen's Crawley. There was a show of courtesy kept up between the rectory and the Hall ladies, between the younger ones at least, for Mrs. Bute and Lady Southdown never could meet without battles, and gradually ceased seeing each other at all. Her ladyship kept her room when the ladies from the rectory visited their cousins at the Hall. Perhaps Mr. Pitt was not very much displeased at these occasional absences of his mamma-in-law. He believed the Binkie family to be the greatest and wisest and most interesting in the world, and her ladyship and his aunt had long held ascendancy over him. But sometimes he felt that she commanded him too much. To be considered young was complimentary, doubtless, but at 46, to be treated as a boy was sometimes mortifying. Lady Jane yielded up everything, however, to her mother. She was only fond of her children in private, and it was lucky for her that Lady Southdown's multifarious business, her conferences with ministers, and her correspondence with all the missionaries of Africa, Asia, and Australia, etc., occupied the venerable Countess a great deal, so that she had but little time to devote to her granddaughter, the little Matilda, and her grandson, Master Pitt Crawley. The latter was a feeble child, and it was only by prodigious quantities of calomel that Lady Southdown was able to keep him in life at all. As for Sir Pitt, he retired into those very apartments where Lady Crawley had been previously extinguished, and here was tended by Miss Hester, the girl upon her promotion with constant care and assiduity. What love, what fidelity, what constancy is there equal to that of a nurse with good wages? They smooth pillows, and make arrowroot. They get up at nights, they bear complaints and querulousness. They see the sun shining out of doors and don't want to go abroad. They sleep on armchairs and eat their meals in solitude. They pass long, long evenings doing nothing, watching the embers and the patient's drink simmering in the jug. They read the weekly paper the whole week through, and Law's Serious Call or The Whole Duty of Man suffices them for literature for the year. And we quarrel with them because when their relations come to see them once a week, a little gin is smuggled into their linen basket. Ladies, what man's love is there that would stand a year's nursing of the object of his affection? Whereas a nurse will stand by you for £10 a quarter, and we think her too highly paid. At least Mr. Crawley grumbled a good deal about paying half as much to Miss Hester for her constant attendance upon the baronet, his father. Of sunshiny days, this old gentleman was taken out in a chair on the terrace, the very chair which Miss Crawley had had at Brighton, and which had been transported thence with a number of Lady Southdown's effects to Queen's Crawley. Lady Jane always walked by the old man, and was an evident favourite with him. He used to nod many times to her, and smile when she came in, and utter inarticulate deprecatory moans when she was going away. When the door shut upon her, he would cry and sob, whereupon Hester's face and manner, which was always exceedingly bland and gentle while her lady was present, would change at once, and she would make faces at him and clench her fist and scream out, "Hold your tongue, you stupid old fool!" and twirl away his chair from the fire, which he loved to look at which he would cry more. For this was all that he had left after more than 70 years of cunning and struggling and drinking and scheming and sin and selfishness. A whimpering old idiot, put in and out of bed and cleaned and fed like a baby. At last a day came when the nurse's occupation was over. Early one morning, as Pitt Crawley was at his steward's and bailiff's books in the study, a knock came to the door, and Hester presented herself, dropping a curtsy, and said, "If you please, Sir Pitt, Sir Pitt died this morning, Sir Pitt. I was a-making of his toast, Sir Pitt, for his gruel, Sir Pitt, which he took every morning regular at 6, Sir Pitt, and I thought I heard a moan like Sir Pitt, and... She dropped another curtsy. What was it that made Pitt's pale face flush quite red? Was it because he was Sir Pitt at last, with a seat in Parliament, and perhaps future honours in prospect? I'll clear the estate now with the ready money, he thought, and rapidly calculated its encumbrances and the improvements which he would make. He would not use his aunt's money previously, lest Sir Pitt should recover and his outlay be in vain. All the blinds were pulled down at the hall and rectory, the church bell was tolled, and the chancel hung in black. And Bute Crawley didn't go to a coursing meeting, but went and dined quietly at Fuddleston, where they talked about his deceased brother and young Sir Pitt over their port. Miss Betsy, who was by this time married to a saddler at Mudbury, cried a good deal. The family surgeon rode over and paid his respectful compliments and inquiries for the health of their ladyships. The death was talked about at Mudbury and at the Crawley Arms. The landlord whereof had become reconciled with the rector of late, who was occasionally known to step into the parlour and taste Mr. Horrocks' mild beer. "Shall I write to your brother, or will you?" asked Lady Jane of her husband, Sir Pitt. "I will write, of course," Sir Pitt said, "and invite him to the funeral. It will be but becoming." And Mrs. Rawdon," said Lady Jane timidly. "Jane," said Lady Southdown, "how can you think of such a thing?" "Not whilst I am in the house," said Lady Southdown. "But Mrs. Rawdon must be asked, of course," said Sir Pitt resolutely. "Your ladyship will be pleased to recollect that I am the head of this family," Sir Pitt replied. "If you please, Lady Jane, you will write a letter to Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, requesting her presence upon this melancholy occasion." "Jane, I forbid you to put pen to paper," cried the Countess. "I believe I am the head of this family," Sir Pitt repeated, "and however much I may regret any circumstance which may lead to your ladyship quitting this house, must, if you please, continue to govern it as I see fit." Lady Southdown rose up as magnificent as Mrs. Siddons in Lady Macbeth, and ordered that horses may be put to her carriage. If her son and daughter turned her out of their house, she would hide her sorrows somewhere in loneliness and pray for their conversion to better thoughts. "We don't turn you out of our house, mamma," said the timid Lady Jane imploringly. "You invite such company to it as no Christian lady should meet, and I will have my horses tomorrow morning." "Have the goodness to write, Jane, under my dictation," said Sir Pitt, rising and throwing himself into an attitude of command, like the portrait of a gentleman in the exhibition. "And begin, Queen's Crawley, September 14th, 1822. My dear brother." Hearing these decisive and terrible words, Lady Macbeth, who had been waiting for a sign of weakness or vacillation on the part of her son-in-law, rose, and with a scared look left the library. Lady Jane looked up to see if her husband would fain follow, and soothed the mamma, but Pitt forbade his wife to move. "She won't go away," he said. "She's let her house in Brighton and has spent her last year's dividends. A countess living at an inn is a ruined woman. I've been waiting long for an opportunity to take this decisive step, my love. For as you must perceive, it is impossible that there should be two chiefs in a family. And now, if you please, we will resume the dictation. My dear brother, the melancholy intelligence which it is my duty to convey to my family must have been long anticipated by, etc." In a word, Pitt having come to his kingdom, and having by good luck, or desert rather, as he considered, assumed almost all the fortune which his other relatives had expected, was determined to treat his family kindly and respectably, and to make a house of Queen's Crawley once more. It pleased him to think that he should be its chief. He proposed to use the vast influence that his commanding talents and position must speedily acquire for him in the county, to get his brother placed and his cousins decently provided for, and perhaps had a little string of repentance as he thought that he was the proprietor of all that they had hoped for. In the course of 3 or 4 days' reign, his bearing was changed, and his plans quite fixed. He determined to rule justly and honestly, to depose Lady Southdown, and to be on the friendliest possible terms with all the relations of his blood. So he dictated a letter to his brother Rawdon, a solemn and elaborate letter containing the profoundest observations, couched in the longest words, and filling with wonder the simple little secretary who wrote under her husband's order. "What an orator this will be," thought she, "when he enters the House of Commons." On which point, and on the tyranny of Lady Southdown, Pitt had sometimes dropped hints to his wife in bed. "How wise and good, and what a genius my husband is! I fancied him a little cold, but how good, and what a genius!" The fact is, Pitt Crawley had got every word of the letter by heart, and had studied it with diplomatic secrecy, deeply and perfectly, long before he thought fit to communicate it to his astonished wife. This letter, with a huge black border and seal, was accordingly dispatched by Sir Pitt Crawley to his brother the Colonel in London. Rawdon Crawley was but half pleased with the receipt of it. "Oh, what's the use of going down to that stupid place," thought he. "I can't stand being alone with Pitt after dinner, and horses there and back will cost us £20. He carried the letter, as he did all difficulties, to Becky, upstairs in her bedroom, with her chocolate, which he always made and took to her in the morning. He put the tray with the breakfast and the letter on the dressing-table, before which Becky sat combing her yellow hair. She took up the black-edged missive, and having read it, she jumped up from the chair, crying, "Hooray!" and waving the note round her head. "Hooray?" said Rawdon, wondering at the little figure capering about in a streaming flannel dressing-gown with tawny locks dishevelled. "He's not left us anything, Becky. I had my share when I came of age." "You'll never be of age, you silly old man," Becky replied. "Run out now to Madame Brunoy's, for I must have some mourning, and get a crape for your hat, and a black waistcoat. I don't think you've got one. Order it to be brought home tomorrow, so that we may be able to start on Thursday." "You don't mean to go?" Rawdon interposed. "Of course I mean to go. I mean that Lady Jane shall present me at court next year. I mean that your brother shall give you a seat in Parliament, you stupid old creature. I mean that Lord Stein shall have your vote and his, my dear old silly man, and that you shall be an Irish secretary. or a West Indian governor, or a treasurer, or a consul, or some such thing." "Posting will be cost of deuce a lot of money," grumbled Rawdon. "We might take Southdown's carriage, which ought to be present at the funeral, as he is a relation of the family. Oh, but no, I intend that we should go by the coach. They'll like it better. It seems more humble." "Roddy goes, of course?" the colonel asked. "No such thing. Why pay an extra place? He's too big to travel bodkin between you and me. Let him stay here in the nursery, and Briggs can make him a black frock. Go you and do as I bid you. And you had best tell Sparks, your man, that old Sir Pitt is dead, and that you will come in for something considerable when the affairs are arranged. He'll tell this to Raggles, who's been pressing for money, and it will console poor Raggles." And so Becky began sipping her chocolate. When the faithful Lord Stein arrived in the evening, he found Becky and her companion, who was no other than our friend Briggs, busy cutting, ripping, snipping, and tearing all sorts of black stuffs available for the melancholy occasion. "Miss Briggs and I are plunged in grief and despondency for the death of our papa," Rebecca said. "Sir Pitt Crawley is dead, my lord. We've been tearing our hair out all the morning, and now we're tearing up our old clothes." "Oh, Rebecca, how can you?" was all that Briggs could say as she turned up her eyes. "Oh, Rebecca, how can you?" echoed my lord. "So that old scoundrel's dead, is he? He might have been a peer if he'd played his cards better. Mr. Pitt had very nearly made him, but he ratted always at the wrong time. What an old Silenus he was!" "I might have been Silenus's widow," said Rebecca. "Don't you remember, Miss Briggs, how you peeped in at the door and saw old Sir Pitt on his knees to me?" Miss Briggs, our old friend, blushed very much at this reminiscence, and was glad when Lord Stein ordered her to go downstairs and make him a cup of tea. Briggs was the house dog whom Rebecca had provided as guardian of her innocence and reputation. Miss Crawley had left her a little annuity. She would have been content to remain in the Crawley family with Lady Jane, who was good to her and to everybody. But Lady Southdown dismissed poor Briggs as quickly as decency permitted, and Mr. Pitt, who thought himself much injured by the uncalled-for generosity of his deceased relative towards the lady who had been Miss Crawley's only faithful retainer a score of years, made no objection to that exercise of the dowager's authority. Bowles and Firkin likewise received their legacies and their dismissals, and married and set up a lodging-house according to the custom of their kind. Briggs tried to live with her relations in the country, but found that attempt was vain after the better society to which she'd been accustomed. Briggs' friends, small tradesmen in a country town, quarrelled over Miss Briggs' £40 a year as eagerly and openly as Miss Crawley's kinfolk had for that lady's inheritance. Briggs' brother, a radical hatter and grocer, called his sister a purse-proud aristocrat because she would not advance a part of her capital to stock his shop, and she would have done so likely, but that their sister, a dissenting shoemaker's lady at variance with the hatter and the grocer, who went to another chapel, showed how their brother was on the verge of bankruptcy, and took possession of Briggs for a little while. The dissenting shoemaker wanted Miss Briggs to send his son to college and to make a gentleman of him. Between them, the two families got a great portion of her private savings out of her, and finally she fled to London, followed by the anathematus of both, and determined to seek for servitude again, as infinitely less onerous than liberty. And advertising in the papers that a gentlewoman of agreeable manners and accustomed to the best society was anxious to, etc., she took up her residence with Mr. Bowles in Half Moon Street, and waited the result of the advertisement. So it was that she fell in with Rebecca. Mrs. Rawdon's dashing little carriage and ponies was whirling down the street one day, just as Miss Briggs, fatigued, had reached Mr. Bowles' door after a weary walk to the Times office in the city to insert her advertisement for the 6th time. Rebecca was driving, and at once recognized the gentlewoman with agreeable manners, and being a perfectly good-humored woman, as we have seen, and having a regard for Briggs, she pulled up the ponies at the doorsteps, gave the reins to the groom, and jumping out, had both of Briggs' hands before she had the agreeable manners recovered from the shock of seeing an old friend. Briggs cried, and Becky laughed a great deal and kissed the gentlewoman as soon as they had gotten into the passage, and thence into Mrs. Bowles' front parlour with the red moreen curtains, and the round looking-glass and the chained eagle above, gazing back upon the ticket in the window which announced "Apartments to Let." Briggs told all her history, amidst those perfectly uncalled-for sobs and ejaculations of wonder with which women in her soft nature salute an old acquaintance, or regard a rencontre in the street. For though people meet other people every day, yet some there are who insist upon discovering miracles, and women, even though they have disliked each other, begin to cry when they meet, deploring and remembering the time when they last quarrelled. So, in a word, Briggs told all her history, and Becky gave a narrative of her own life with the usual artlessness and candour. Mrs. Bowles, late Firkin, came and listened grimly in the passage to the hysterical sniffling and giggling which went on in the front parlour. Becky had never been a favourite of hers. Since the establishment of the married couple in London, they had frequented their former friends of the house of Raggles, and did not like the latter's account of the Colonel's menage. "I wouldn't trust him, Rag, my boy," Bowles remarked. And his wife, when Mrs. Rawdon issued from the parlour, only saluted the lady with a very sour curtsy, and her fingers were like so many sausages, cold and lifeless, when she held them out in deference to Mrs. Rawdon, who persisted in shaking hands with the retired lady's maid. She whirled away into Piccadilly, nodding with the sweetest of smiles towards Miss Briggs, who hung nodding at the window close under the advertisement card. And at the next moment Becky was in the park with a half-dozen of dandies cantering after her carriage. When she found how her friend was situated, and how, having a snug legacy from Miss Crawley, salary was no object to our gentlewoman, Becky instantly formed some benevolent little domestic plans concerning her. This was just such a companion as would suit her establishment, and she invited Briggs to come to dinner with her that very evening, when she should see Becky's dear, darling little Rawdon. Mrs. Bowles cautioned her lodger against venturing into the lion's den. "Wherein you will rue it, Miss B., mark my words, and be sure as my name is Bowles." And Briggs promised to be very cautious. The upshot of which caution was that she went to live with Mrs. Rawdon the next week, and had lent Rawdon Crawley £600 upon annuity before 6 months was over. End of chapter 40.